All right, for the final panel of the day, we will shift the focus of the economic and trade discussion away from a U.S.-centric view and look at the impact that the TPP and the RCEP will have from a national and regional perspective from Asia, including other regional economic powers like Japan and South Korea. First, we'll hear from Ms. Shihoko Goto, who will discuss the role that nationalism and national identity has and will play in multilateral trade pacts. She is the Senior Northeast Asia Associate here at the Woodrow Wilson Center's Asia program, where she focuses on issues related to Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. She's a contributing editor to The Globalist, a fellow at the Mansfield Foundation, and she's spent over a decade as a journalist writing about international political economy in Asia for Dow Jones and UPI, and still provides analysis for media outlets today. Then we will hear from Dr. William Brooks, who will get into the hard-end mechanics of the TPP and RCEP negotiations, examining in some detail the differences between them, look at the bottlenecks within each, and evaluate the prospects for successful outcomes. He is a senior advisor at the Edwin Reischauer Center for East Asian Studies at SAIS at Johns Hopkins University, where he is also an adjunct professor. He has had a 35-year career at the State Department. In his last assignment, he managed a portion of the U.S. Embassy at Tokyo, where he also earlier served in its economics section. More recently, he has written 2 books on different aspects of the U.S.-Japan relationship, one on the politics of the Futenma-based dispute on Okinawa, and the other looking at the broader sweep of the alliance. So we will now turn to Ms. Goto.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for being here, and for those of you who've been here from early this morning and have stayed until the bitter end, thank you in particular. We've had, I think, a very fruitful discussion thanks to our collaborative efforts with FPRI, and I'm very grateful that we have been able to do this, and I hope it's going to be the beginning of a great working partnership between the Wilson Center and FPRI. We've had discussions about more trouble looming on the horizons of Northeast Asia. We've talked this morning also about the role nationalism plays or could play in policymaking, especially in the foreign policy arena. We've also talked, I was very heartened by the last panel's optimism. Quite frankly, it wasn't even cautious optimism. It was really optimistic about the outlook for TPP. And we've also talked about the potential role that US-China relations may have in establishing future trade and other international economic frameworks. But I've seen a little blank in our discussion today, and that is really about public opinion and trade. And I want to highlight some findings from a Pew Research report in September, which polled people in 44 countries. And 81% of those said that trade is a good thing, which is rather heartening. But there's a sharp contrast between industrialized and emerging markets. 55% of countries that belong to the TPP said trade frameworks actually creates jobs. But Japan, those polled in Japan said only 20% actually found that trade agreements are a job maker. And in the United States, that figure was even lower, that only 15% of Americans polled believe that trade deals create jobs. Conversely, China sees that figure at 61%. So 61% of Chinese believe that trade agreements in general create jobs. And in Korea, that figure is at 45%. So there is a sharp contrast between the big movers of TPP and those outside of TPP who could potentially join TPP and perceiving what trade could and cannot do for them. I think this is something we should bear in mind, especially when we're at the final push for moving forward with TPP. Yes, TPP negotiations are behind closed doors, but at the same time, so much depends on congressional approval, namely of TPA moving forward. And so this kind of negative fear of trade is something that we need to bear in mind. Someone like Joe Stiglitz, who is a Nobel Prize-winning economist, is a leading naysayer for TPP. He says that the negotiations are actually, quote, on the wrong side of globalization, unquote. And he argues that trade barriers are already low enough and that further liberalization would actually lead to a race to the bottom, and that it would actually lead to greater not only job loss, but also it would put downward pressure on wages in the United States and industrialized countries. This argument is a incredibly valid one, but I think this is not the place to talk further about it. But at the same time, I want to take this opportunity to talk about the political drivers and the political barriers in moving forward with mega trade deals, including the TPP. And one truth that we have found today that I think we can all agree on is that for the United States, TPP is not just in its economic interest, but it's also in its political and security interest. Yes, there are many obligations and commitments and interests that the United States has outside of Asia, especially given the current situation in Russia, Ukraine, and the Middle East. But nonetheless, the rebalance towards Asia is and should remain real. But Obama has actually really taken a back seat in this conversation about pushing TPP forward. He's, instead of advocating the political and the security dimension of TPP, he's really let the USTR's Froman take the lead in advocating for the US position on this. I think that's actually been to the detriment of the United States in moving the conversation forward. For instance, there's really been limited media coverage of TPP. And yes, I love inside US trade as much as anyone, but I don't think it's as widely read as the New York Times or as watched as NBC. So I think to have that kind of high profile advocate for TPP would be something that is really in the US interest. So what happens when this conversation is really focused on the trade journals? We see that the coverage really focuses more on the friction of industry interests, and we don't really talk about the broader strategy behind it. And we can see how this is played out, for instance, in US-Japan relations. A Japan caucus was founded on the Hill earlier this year, and one of its head joint chairs is Devin Nunes, who is also the head of the House Ways and Means Subcommittee on Trade. And yet he was one of about 140 other members of Congress who presented a public letter to Obama stating that Japan is dragging its foot in making TPP happen, especially on the agricultural issues, and therefore TPP really ought to move forward without Japan and also Canada. That kind of friction has blown over, and there is no longer talk about excluding Japan and Canada from the 12-member country negotiations. But it did bear a lot of ill will on both sides, especially in Japan, and that has really taken the limelight away from some of the common interests that the two sides share. Because it is clear that it's not just the United States that needs to be continually engaged in Asia. It's for all member countries of TPP, and it's in the interest of the region as a whole as well. Which brings me to the second reality. And that is to say that Japan needs TPP for structural reform. I think this has been mentioned a couple of times today already, but I want to elaborate a little bit on that. When Prime Minister Abe declared over a year ago that Japan would become a member negotiating country for TPP, it was heralded by the Japanese as very visionary and very risk-taking. Risk-taking because it came at a time a couple of months before the Japanese Diet's upper house elections, and so the timing didn't seem all that conducive that he was actually taking a political risk. But at the same time, it was, given the timeline of the TPP negotiations, this was the best time for Japan to enter at the almost end stage of the last part of the negotiations. Since then, Prime Minister Abe has, in contrast to President Obama, has really taken a lot of steps to publicize the need for TPP and to stress that without it, Japan will actually be left behind in the global economy. That has actually really raised the visibility of the TPP negotiations in Japan. And it's very interesting to see how talks about TPP, for instance, the last weekend's negotiations in Sydney, were like top news on NHK, which is the national broadcaster. That said, what's striking too is that the most contentious issue at the moment, which is agriculture and agricultural protection, it actually only represents a very minuscule part of the Japanese economy. It's agriculture represents less than 1% of Japanese GDP, and it represents only about 5% of the population. And also, I mean, no offense for being ageist, but the vast majority of those who are active farmers are over 65 years old. So the heart of the matter is that TPP is actually less about market access for Japan, and it's really more about rebalancing the domestic political economy. And TPP can be leveraged as a tool to overcome obstacles for reform, which includes agriculture, but it is not the biggest issue at stake. What Japan actually really needs for economic reinvigoration is not further breakdown of economic trade barriers. It's actually social change. Japan actually needs more a revolution in its employment practices. It needs to be able to deal with a rapidly aging, graying society. It needs to make better use of women in the workforce. It needs to really prioritize some of its spending to tackle its tremendous debt to GDP ratio. But so why, if the stakes are so high for Japan, and if TPP is so important, why can Japan not concede over pork? Some would argue that the resistance to further the negotiations are facing a critical juncture in Japan at the moment, as a political stance, that the Japanese politicians in particular are wary about giving up on this contentious issue on agriculture until they know that the United States will pass TPA. And without TPA, we know that TPP will not pass in the United States. So once that is done, then Japan may be able to concede to agricultural issues, but not before then. Otherwise, it would seem that Prime Minister Abe is weak, and that is, he's showing a weak hand. Another reality is that TPP isn't just about the United States rebalance towards Asia. It's also redefining Japan's partnership with the United States and its role as a leader in a leadership role in the Asia-Pacific region. Japan has faced nearly 2 decades of stagnation and has faced worries about so-called Japan passing. There has, of course, been a constant of concerns about North Korea, but what really has changed that dynamic is this rapid militarization of China, coupled with growing tensions over territories in both the East and South China Seas. There is relations between Japan and China are frigid at the moment. Relations between Japan and Korea are even frostier, even frigider. The U.S. position at the moment is to remain neutral regarding the ownership of the territories in the East China Sea, but at the same time, the United States has publicly declared that the Senkaku Islands actually come under the auspices of the U.S.-Japan alliance. So what's interesting about all these tensions over the territories in the East China Sea is that even though relations between China and Japan and Korea are possibly at their worst since the end of World War II, there hasn't really been any direct correlation between the diplomatic situation and economic relations. And in fact, under Prime Minister Abe, the Japanese stock market has actually increased by about 50% at one stage. And it's the year high for 2013 on the Japanese stock market was reached only weeks after China declared its ADIZ, its Air Defense Identification Zone, which that kind of defies logic in some respects. I want to also point out that a joint poll by the People's Daily and Gindon, which is a Japanese think tank similar to Pew Research, their poll in September found that 53% of Chinese see a conflict with Japan in the near future. 29% of the Japanese saw a potential conflict with China in the near future. So whatever the situation is, it is clear that this disconnect between economic and diplomatic realities could potentially converge, and that that is a real threat to the stability and prosperity of the East, of the Asia-Pacific region. And so there is no surprise that for the United States, expectations for Japan to pull its own weight for defense purposes is coming through, and that support from the United States for Japan reinterpreting Article 9 and re-examining its pacifist constitution is currently, there is support, even though the official stance of the United States would be to say that each country follows its own path, and the United States would not actually take any particular, prescribe any position for them to follow any particular path. Japan is valued for the United States as a partner that ensures regional stability as well as security. And TPP is a mechanism to highlight the common interests of not just Japan and the United States, but all 12 member countries. So it is a mechanism to identify those common values, and failure to identify and promote and protect those interests would actually have negative consequences that Bonnie Glaser was talking about earlier this morning. So, oh, sorry, I need to rush. So the truth is that TPP is more than just a trade agreement. It's actually one vision of regional integration. And just as the hub and spoke mechanism for security is now being assessed in a more multilateral approach to security, TPP is also a way to go beyond bilateral free trade agreements and have a more multilateral arrangement for trade. But TPP obviously is not the only vision that's out there. Others are in the works. RCEP, even though TPP negotiations will come to head again at the next upcoming APEC meeting, RCEP, which is ASEAN plus 6 countries, will meet again in December. And I should note that RCEP actually represents 30% of global GDP and about half of the world's population, and it's representing the most dynamic population in the world and with the most economic potential. Japan is unique insofar as it is a member country of both RCEP and TPP as well. And whilst China's relations between Japan and China are frigid, as I said, it is Japan's biggest trading partner. So it is, and that's worth bearing in mind. But as I said, there is some impact from the recent tensions going on in the East China Sea. For instance, the Japanese Trade Ministry in August reported that Japanese foreign direct investment reached its highest level in 2013, but its FDI with China actually fell 33%, whereas it reached a record high with ASEAN to 23.6 billion that year. Similarly, Chinese trade with ASEAN rose 11% on year two, but it actually fell 5% with Japan at that time. RCEP is as much about tapping into the potential of ASEAN and Southeast Asia, and it's as much as it is an alternative vision and an alternative framework to TPP. ASEAN is a mechanism that actually brings together China, the United States, and Japan together. And so that actually highlights the importance of RCEP. But it's also worth bearing in mind that when we talk about the lower standards of RCEP compared to TPP, much of it is because the member countries of RCEP don't want the kind of liberalization and change in rules that TPP is trying to promote. I should point out that Peter Petrie of Brandeis University and also a fellow at the Peterson Institute expects that by 2025, income gain from TPP for Japan will rise to 105 billion. And if for Japan to gain from RCEP, it would reach 96 billion. Essentially, this would be as a result of increased market access from RCEP, benefiting the production networks that Japan has from across the region. But the biggest gainer of RCEP would actually be China. China would see $250 billion in income gain compared to 96 billion that Japan is projected to have. I have a little bit more time, so I'm going to wrap up. We can talk about the pros and cons of TPP and RCEP at length, and I hope that Bill will do that for me after me. But I want to stress that the bigger goal of trade liberalization is not just about who wins, and it's actually about encouraging steady growth and decreasing the income gap between countries. And I have to say that China is actually coming up with a more comprehensive strategy to reach those goals than Japan is at the moment, especially with the announcement of the Infrastructure Investment Bank this week. I think that, and possibilities of FTA, AP, FTAP, the free trade agreement of the Asia Pacific that is expected to move forward at the APEC meeting this next month as well. There needs to be a connection of trade liberalization with development, and there needs to be greater connection of development assistance with the growth of trade opportunities. My last point, there's a proliferation of trade deals. There's RCEP, TPP, FTAP. There are a number of bilateral agreements in the works as well. China, Korea Free Trade Agreement is certainly one of them. But there is no need to choose one over the other. I think we should see the convergence of these many mega regional trade deals in the works, these many bilateral trade negotiations in the works as an opportunity to consider global standards simultaneously. It's an opportunity to promote reform and rule changes, not in a piecemeal way, but in a more comprehensive manner. And that hopefully will lead to higher standards worldwide at the same time. And it will be an opportunity for member countries to actually look forward in moving in economic growth and not actually looking backwards. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we'll turn to Dr. Brooks.
Thank you very much. It's a challenge to come on last after a long day of a conference, and particularly since most of the people have already left, so my job is to make sure nobody else leaves and keep the rest of you awake. Also, it's a challenge because most everybody has said almost everything that I wanted to say, but I'll try to find a way of saying it a little bit differently. And it could have been worse. A year ago, I was the last in an all-day conference that ended at 4 o'clock, and I came on at 4 o'clock. And you can imagine what happened, and everybody was leaving, and I was trying to keep them in. At any rate, I have a presentation here. It should be about 15 minutes, and some of it will duplicate. Hopefully other parts will not. The first slide is actually not exactly accurate. It says noodle bowl of existing bilateral and regional trade pacts. Actually, it's an oversimplification. I counted about 37 FTAs and EPAs that are floating around the East Asia, the Asian Pacific. And actually, we talk about the noodle bowl in Asia. Well, take a look at this next slide, which is the noodle bowl in the world. And now you know why we need a mega FTA like a TPP. Going back to East Asia regional economic integration, until the TPP and RCEP came on the scene, integration has been basically market-driven. Intra-regional trade and investment patterns. The main driver has not been these FTAs or EPAs. A lot of these are mostly cherry picking of what's easy and what's not easy. But it has been market-driven. The TPP is, of course, the U.S. trying to change the game with the government leading. But if you take a look at interregional dependency in East Asia trade, in 1990, intra-regional trade was 43.1% already in East Asia. It went up to about 50% in 1995. After that, there was an Asian currency crisis, et cetera, but now it's still about 50% intra-regional trade. EU is 65%, so it's not bad. Market-driven has done an awful lot, and we'll talk about Japan a little bit later. The mega FTA schemes that are on the platter right now, as you can see, it's quite a significant step forward from the noodle bowl, and my own perception is that all of this arrives because First, the noodle bowl arose because the WTO Doha round went moribund and led to the proliferation of bilateral FTAs. And now, finally, there is a kind of sort of a critical mass that has been reached, so that significant mega regionalism can finally come to pass and sort out the rules and regulations. The timetable for the implementation, this is a guess, it's not completely accurate. TPP, as we heard from previous speakers, probably will be launched sometimes in 2015. RCEP is moving at a much more leisurely pace, probably 2015-16 or so. TTIP about the same pace as RCEP. And of course, not to be overlooked, Republic of Korea, People's Republic of China is also moving in a direction of maybe 2015 for their FTA. And of course, all of this could lead ultimately to the reconstitution of the WTO Doha round, as we'll get back to. What is TPP? Well, by now you probably know this in your sleep. But it was hoped that the negotiations could be wrapped up by the APEC meeting in Beijing this fall. This timetable is definitely likely to slip, as we'll get back to in a minute. But indeed, it is a high quality, very high quality and ambitious 21st century agreement that will enhance trade investment among the partner countries, promote innovation, economic growth, development, support the creation and retention of jobs. My understanding is that President Obama, really liked it because it was going to create jobs in the United States. TPP's economic benefits to the United States. There was somebody from Peterson Institute earlier, so I'm going to cheat and use some of their figures. TPP agreement provides global income benefits of an estimated $223 billion per year by 2025. Real income benefits to the United States, an estimated $77 billion. TPP could generate an estimate $305 billion in additional world exports per year by 2025, including an additional $123.5 billion in U.S. exports. This is probably making President Obama very, very happy to read these reports. The RCEP, it's again a similar type of arrangement where in this case 16 countries making up 45% of the world population and about a third of world GDP have gotten together, sponsored by ASEAN and including China and other FTA partners, to put together a regional comprehensive FTA that will seemingly compete with TPP. Here is the list of characters, and as you can see, the United States is not in RCEP, and China is not in TP, and we'll get back to that. But here's the deal. I believe that RCEP is a possible way to meet a TPP at some point, that the RCEP is a possible way to usher into an FTAAP by 2020 or later, a free trade area of the Asia Pacific, and that's exactly what I think the TPP is heading for. So there is a point where the two concepts could come together, the two memberships could come together. They already overlap with members, and in that sense form a huge mega FTA that covers the entire Asia Pacific. And in this way, if they can reconcile the differences between the two, and there is a difference in standard, obviously, the WTO Doha round through a back door, the goals of the Doha round through a back door are realized. And as I said, the RCEP members are working to conclude negotiations in 2015, but that could slip. So the difference between the two, TPP aims to be high-quality preferential trade agreement with few exemptions and extensive regulatory alignment in such areas as labor law, environmental protection, intellectual property rights. RCEP, on the other hand, has a lower standard. It accepts the countries will reduce trade barriers at different rates, especially among less developed members, and makes limited demands for regulatory harmonization. So the two will have to emerge by reconciling these differences. Hopefully, over time, RCEP, once it is launched, will gradually reach the stage where it can reconcile its differences between the two. So, as for the United States, the United States needs a TPP, and I've also thrown in TTIP, to be concluded successfully. Critical agreements. If the two mega FTAs are implemented, this would make up two-thirds of global GDP and a half of global trade, and a market of 1.3 billion customers. Nearly 70% of U.S. exports go to those countries, and 84% of FDI in the U.S. comes from those countries. The markets would grow by $6.7 trillion, and two-thirds of world trade would be liberalized. And of course, the major irony of all of this is that in TPP, China is still not a member of the TPP. Earlier, it was explained that China is interested. I think it is interested, but right now, China is not qualified, frankly. It's not being excluded, it's just not qualified, frankly, to be a member of the TPP. That'll have to come in the future. What does it mean with Japan as a member of the TPP? If Japan finishes its negotiations, and I think that can be done, it becomes 40%, the 12 countries form 40% of world GDP, the largest bloc. ASEAN is 23%, RCEP is 28%, and EU is 26%. And if TTIP replaces, if that is successful, it would replace TPP as the largest bloc. So right now, TPP would be the largest, but once TTIP is launched, then that becomes the largest bloc. Put the two together, and you have a huge, huge bloc of the world economy. Does Japan need TPP? As I mentioned, Japan has lots of EPAs. They're really sweetheart deals, cherry-picking things that did not, so there really wasn't any real tough decisions made with most of those EPAs. They're called EPAs, so easy PAs rather than FTAs. But as a result, Japan's exports to these partners has been growing by leaps and bounds, reaching a record high of 6.6 trillion yen in the January-June period this year. And TPP members already make up 27% of Japan's total exports and 40.5% of its DFI. So Japan indeed wants to get in, not just for national interests, not just for spurring its own reform, but it believes it's going to make money. So Japan joined in order to help set the rules for trade investment. And this is something which the U.S. doesn't share. And I've heard this in Tokyo several times as a means to keep rising China's economic influence in check. Again, the U.S. doesn't have that view, but I've heard this view in Tokyo. The Petrie and Plummer calculation showed that TPP would be pushed up by 2%. TPP would push up GDP by 2% in Japan if Japan joins TPP. The other scales are much more modest. The ADB has it as 1%. So Japan's win-win strategy, it basically joins TPP, simultaneously joins RCEP. It goes for a Japan, China, South Korea FTA. Well, that's going nowhere as fast, but it's still trying. And the Japan-EU EPA to build economic partnership networks covering most of Japan's trade partners. So this is an incredible win-win strategy, and if all these things come through, Japan's economy would get a tremendous boost. This is just the same thing in schematic form. So what about RCEP? RCEP participation is most important for Japan for a very interesting reason. In order to protect and expand its current supply chain or production network in the region. According to JETRO, the RCEP's share of locations where Japanese companies procure parts is about 90%. Because of its well-installed production network, that will become even more efficient should it sign on with RCEP. Even if it doesn't join TPP, RCEP for Japan is a very, very important part of its current production network. And of course, RCEP represents no threat to Japanese agricultural interests because it has lax rules in those regions. What about the U.S. and RCEP? Is there a rivalry? Is there a clash between the two rivals, Godzilla and King Kong? Well, TPP is not designed to contain China. Why isn't China welcome now into TPP negotiations? It's just not qualified. Again, I mentioned it earlier. When it is qualified, it'll probably be about the time when the Asia-Pacific FTA is being negotiated. And probably when that happens, China will be capable and eager to come in. Is China trying to keep the U.S. out of RCEP? I don't know, but I don't think the U.S. is qualified to come into RCEP since it's set up by ASEAN and it includes other countries that are in the region, and the U.S. is not in the region. But CCTV has been touting RCEP as the biggest thing since sliced bread. RCEP has a launch date, was launched in 2012, a target date of 2015. Again, this is something you have been hearing from others before me, but I'll just say it's the TPP is seen as much more likely than RCEP to set up a new high standard rules and standards that would fulfill the WTO goals. China and Japan would dominate RCEP if once it's launched. China with 37% share of GDP, total GDP of those members, and Japan with 29%. And if you add India, China, India, and Japan become the three largest members in terms of population and GDP in terms of PPP. Again, this is a schematic that was shown earlier, showing the overlapping membership of RCEP and TPP members. Interestingly enough, the ROK may be in the best position in FTA scores. It's got a pretty good thing going here. It's got an FTA talks with China, with the EU, stalled talks with Japan. We don't know when those will go on, but it's already signed one with the United States. And if Japan opts out of the TPP, South Korea's really could be the unexpected winner in the region. Since 2000 to 2013, South Korea's share of trade with China has risen from 9% to 21%. If shares of trade and if there's a FTA with China, it's going to even go higher. Interestingly, the shares of trade with the United States and Japan have dropped from 20 to 10% with the U.S. and from 16 to 9% with Japan. If Japan doesn't join the TPP, a status quo option, and fails to win EPAs with China and has none with the EU, again, the beneficiary would be the ROK, which already has an FTA with the U.S. and with the EU, and has negotiated an FTA with China. Japan's cabinet office has calculated that Japan's exports of autos, machinery, electronics, all the goodies, would decline by 20%, and the country would lose 10.5 trillion yen in GDP if this kind of scenario came into existence. There are Asian doubts about the U.S.'s rebalancing to Asia. This is a sort of interesting pivot. And U.S. motives for the TPP are suspect, and worries that TPP may not flower as originally planned. Some Western journalists have declared TPP even dead in the water. I found a whole bunch of stuff, dead in the water, moribund, you're about ready to collapse. Very, very negative, negative views about TPP in the Western press, and particularly seen because of Japan's alleged stubbornness to give in on its key issues. What are the issues that the U.S. has with Japan? Most of them have actually been worked out in negotiations. There are only two major ones remaining: agricultural imports to Japan and auto trade. In fact, somebody just said pork recently in one of the earlier ones. I heard the same thing, that pork and autos are the two stumbling blocks between the two. But I'm putting the 5 sacred areas: rice, sugar. Interesting, sugar is protected all over the world, apparently. Sugar in Japan is grown in Okinawa and some of the outer islands. It's their only cash crop. So if they take away the subsidies that they get for sugar, those little islands and those little economies will just go bottom up. Beef and pork, dairy products, and wheat. Wheat, I can't imagine. Japan imports 90% of its wheat, but it puts tariffs or quotas. In fact, the government basically buys all the wheat and then resells it and gives subsidies to the farmers. The United States side blames Japan's auto Keiretsu system. The manufacturers control the dealerships for blocking sales of U.S. autos in Japan. When I was in the economics section of the American Embassy in the late 1980s, this issue was on the board, still on the board. Ironically, the system has not hurt European cars, which are doing well, thank you, in marketing in Japan, and 4.6 of the domestic market is held by foreign cars from Europe. And also on the U.S. side, in fact, during recent negotiations, allegedly the U.S. refused to lower tariffs on Japanese autos, 2.5%, and trucks, 25% for the next 25 years or something like that. And of course, this is because the big three have a lot of clout on the Congress. So the remaining bottlenecks, beef, pork, auto parts, and U.S. congressional objections, and the willingness perhaps of the Congress to give President Obama an FTA. But is agriculture that seriously a problem with Japan? Is the Japanese agriculture that closed to foreign goods? Despite the sensitive products like those 5 I mentioned, Japan imports 60% of its food, 90% of its wheat, 60% of its sugar, and even imports rice under the WTO Uruguay round as a minimum access agreement. It has a huge tariff on the rest of the imported rice. And of course, Japan's consumers refuse to buy or eat that imported rice. U.S. farm exports to Japan are very strong, nearly $60 billion in 2013. Actually, the biggest consumer of American farm exports is China, but Japan is fourth. Japan is the 4th largest market for American agriculture. And the United States is a leading agricultural supplier. 5 minutes, okay. Rice is not the only sticky issue. The real issue is not the sensitive products, but the relative weakness of the agricultural sector. Japan had its chance following the WTO Uruguay round to modernize agriculture and put trillions and trillions of yen into the agricultural sector after 1993. All of it went into useless public works construction and not to modernize families. Farming. So the average age of the farmer is 66. Somebody said it was 70. There are only about 2.6 million left. 70% of the farmers are part-timers, and about 1 to 1.5% of GDP is produced by the agricultural sector. So Japan needs drastic reform. just to save time, domestic prices of agricultural products are 1.5 times higher than the international average, according to the OECD, which can be likened to a 51% tariff protection. And here's what happens to the imported rice, the minimum access rice. Only 7% is eaten, at least used for table use. 11% goes into permanent stock. 31% is fed to cows or pigs. And 38% is processed into rice crackers. And some of it's exported to aid. So you don't find it on anybody's table usually. The Congress is a problem. The Ways and Means Committee ranking member Sander Levin, look at the last line, and we must confront Japan's long-standing and persistent exclusions of agriculture and automotive products from its markets. If the STR's deal, Froman's deal with Amati, is not to the Congress's liking, no way that the FTA is going to be given to the president. And then, of course, there are a lot of groups that are against the FTA. I'll skip these two which give the pros and Derek says is pro-TPP and the other one anti-TPP. But Abe has introduced structural agricultural reforms to rescue the dying sector. The agriculture is indeed changing in Japan. There's a white paper that says that corporations, agribusiness is now starting in Japan and have 6.7% of the nation's entire, account for 6.7% of the nation's farmland by 2013. And a number of agricultural corporations have reached almost 14,600, 5 times the figure in 1990. And then Japan is beginning to consciously export farm goods. A goal of 5 trillion yen of farm goods by 2030. So basically turning agriculture into a growth industry and restructuring agriculture to make its economy of scale, make it open to competition, and kick the JA, which is the agricultural co-op, out of the business. The farmers are marching against TPP. You probably won't find anybody here under 65. But look at this. I'm almost finished. TPP with Japan as a member. The red is Japan, blue is the United States. This is huge in terms of the scale of GDP. But what happens if Japan is out of TPP? It's almost the United States. 87% would be the United States. So without Japan in TPP, you might as well just fold it up and go home. It won't have much. So without Japan, TPP is meaningless, since the United States and Japan together make up over 80% of total GDP of the 12 members. And if TPP fails, Japan still can fall back on the other mega regional FTA, RCEP. And RCEP might become the standard for the region, not TPP, and the U.S. comes out the loser. And of course, intra-regional trade will also continue to grow. The scenario is conceivable if the final negotiations are influenced by Congress negatively and a vested interest in American industry. But Prime Minister Abe is weak right now. His numbers in the polls have dropped. He's had scandals in his cabinet. The economy is sputtering a bit. He's got to make a decision to raise the consumption tax to 10%. This is not the time for him to be the strong leader on TPP. I think he's going to kick it down the road and probably make a decision next spring. Unfortunately, there are local elections next spring. With that happy note, I'm ending.
Thank you very much. In the interest of time, I'm just going to have, well, actually, I'm going to take my prerogative as moderator to ask the first question, but then right afterwards, I'm going to open up to questions from the audience. Dr. Brooks, you mentioned that you kind of foresaw or hoped that the RCEP and the TPP would ultimately find some confluence and kind of emerge into this free trade area of the Asia Pacific at some point in the future. But given the very different nature of both RCEP and the TPP, I'm kind of at a loss to see how the mechanism by which that would work to reconcile those differences. The RCEP would probably have to drop its flexibility clause, and it would probably have to adopt things like the IP protection, in which case it becomes more and more looking like the TPP and not the RCEP.
I agree 100%. The merging process is probably going to be TPP on top and RCEP coming up and accepting the fait accompli, if you will. This is assuming that TPP is launched quickly and that sets the standard, and then TPP logically leads into the FTAAP, and then RCEP has to play catch-up ball. But it can't stay out of it. And as more and more members are dual members of both, then I think the consensus will build in RCEP that it should come together. And I'm almost sure that China is not going to stay in a state of stasis. It will continue to improve its IP, its other violations of WTO, and by 2020 or so, when all this should start coming together, it'll be eager. This is an optimistic view. I mean, RCEP could just fall flat, but it's an optimistic view that there is enough convergence of national interests, and that China eventually will be able to step up to the plate and lead RCEP into that convergence. But yeah, they've got to give in some things. And I don't think TPP is going to drop its standards.
Okay, with that, I'll open the questions to the audience. Again, please state your name and your affiliation, and keep your questions brief. In the middle there.
Pat Span, just myself. You mentioned several times that China was not eligible for the TPP. I wonder if you could elaborate on what are the issues keeping China from making some threshold?
Well, most of the issues are what U.S. and China have right now: intellectual property and a lot of the, not the market access issues, but a lot of the rules that are being set that amplify the WTO rules. So there may be several areas that China really cannot qualify for in its negotiations. In other words, it would not be able to meet that high threshold. So I can't give you any specifics because I haven't studied all the 21 rules, the 21 areas, but I would say like intellectual property would be one outstanding example where China would have to step up to the plate. But the qualifications are quite high for all of them, and it wouldn't be agriculture. It wouldn't be in the manufacturing trade area. It would be in the services area.
In the front here first.
Thank you. Vincent Wang from University of Richmond. Is there a scenario under which RCEP can actually be concluded and implemented sooner than TPP? And what would that mean to the United States rebalance policy?
They're going at a pretty leisurely level. It's conceivable that there could be a simultaneous launching of both in 2015. But my sense is that the meetings have not been as productive or as dynamic as the TPP ones have been. So the conclusion is that TPP will conclude quicker because there's a lot of strong political leadership, but RCEP is something which is not driven so much by the political dynamics as the TPP is, and will probably coast along for an extra year or so. I don't get a sense that they're rushing to a conclusion.
If I could add to that, the caveat is U.S. Congress. And my understanding is that TPP is almost nearly completely concluded. There are a few sticking points, but it's ready to be signed. But without TPA, this is not going to move forward. And we have the midterms coming up. We don't know how the political will in the United States under the Obama administration is shaky at best. So will this have to be carried over until the next new president or not? And given that if that is the timing of TPA to be passed, then there is opportunity for RCEP to catch up.
So rather than RCEP going faster,
Right.
TPP
Right.
just slows down.
I mean, given the fact that I remember someone talking about, yes, TPP will be concluded in November. We just don't know which year. So given those circumstances, it may well be that RCEP can catch up.
There's another problem too, and that's ratification by Congress.
Right.
Of course, FTA was signed in 2007, and Congress finally ratified it in 2011. So putting timetables on the end of these negotiations sometimes looks nice, but when the actual real launching occurs, maybe years from now.
Yeah, one over here.
David Sedney, no affiliation. On one of the charts you had, Dr. Brooks, you mentioned TTIP. Is there a dynamic here with TTIP and TTP in terms of sort of marginalizing RCEP? But if TTIP were to be concluded successfully, would that be something you could pull, not necessarily all of RCEP together, but certainly China into TTP separately from RCEP?
Yeah, I think, again, two things. One, yeah, definitely TTIP and TPP launched almost side by side would be an ideal situation and would drag China in that direction, drag many countries in that direction. I mean, that would be, but TTIP is not as easy as TTP. There's a lot of resistance in Europe against that, and until those it's going to be a much tougher negotiation to conclude that one, I think. In Japan, for example, the public opinion is pro-TPP. In many European countries, you can look at Google it and find images TTIP, and you find angry people all over Europe protesting against it. So it's not going to be that easy a sell. But yeah, the dynamics. I mean, ultimately, if RCEP fails, if RCEP it just staggers on and it can't seem to reach an agreement, China would be forced to go somewhere. Otherwise, it would be isolated, and it may just go on its own into an FTA with the United States or something like that, and then join TPP that way. So there are a lot of scenarios, but in all the scenarios that I can see, China eventually is in. It can't. I mean, this is. Somebody talked about the elephant in the room. I mean, China is the elephant in the room that TPP has overlooked. It really should be in, but and as I said, the rule books and probably even the Congress, if it were in, would make it tough to get approval. But China's got to come in somewheres, and my prediction is that it'll come in at the Asia-Pacific FTA stage.
There's a lady in the third row here.
Hi. Thank you for staying till the end yourselves. I appreciate that. So my name is Jasmine Junk. I work for the Food Aid Division of the Foreign Agricultural Service at the USDA. And Ms. Goto had mentioned that there should be a tighter connection between development and trade. And one of our, we have two objectives, and the second one is actually for our projects to expand trade and exports within our beneficiary countries. And we were thinking of other Asian countries that are included in the TPP list and RCEP as well. And I would like to get a feel from you guys what that might look like, what a better strategy would be that would align, presuming that this all passes. What good development strategy do you propose to align better with either trade agreement?
First. Go ahead.
I think this is more of a hypothetical, theoretical, abstract answer rather than a specific, concrete, policy-driven one. But what we are seeing with the creation of these different trade frameworks is not just about how to further economic interests, but it's also to push a political ideology as well. And what is that ideology, and who is going to take leadership of it? And I think when we talk about, no, TPP is not about isolating China, but it is a challenge of China to the existing value system that is based upon a Bretton Woods ideal. And if we look at the investment, infrastructure investment banks situation, we're seeing an alternative to the ADB stroke World Bank model. I think that there are opportunities to rethink and strategize how these, how trade could encourage growth and equity. And I think that would resonate not just in the developing countries of Asia, but actually worldwide. Now, how would that actually translate into food aid? I'm so sorry, I have to do my homework, but I think it's an ideology that would require closer cooperation, not just with the trade ministries, but also with the foreign ministries and the development agencies of the respective governments.
Do you have anything to add?
Just on the values aspect, you know, when the concept of an East Asia community came out under Mahathir many years ago and then was revised by then Prime Minister Hatoyama in 2009, I think that was the attempt to establish a regional architecture that was based on so-called Asian values. The TPP, if it's launched successfully, particularly if it's launched quite early before our RCEP takes full control of itself, means that the values of the Western world, not necessarily the United States, but the values of the Western world, the WTO values have taken precedent, and that an East Asia community under the old concept is basically impossible. So the new architecture becomes something quite different than was envisioned in the earlier iterations.
Jacques?
Thanks, Jacques Delisle, FPRI. Your last comments sort of lead into the question I want to ask, which is we've been talking about how TPP is not designed to contain China and cannot contain China. But what about the other side, which one often hears, which is the RCEP is to some extent designed to exclude the United States, or at least to increase Chinese influence in the region. And we hear about China not being qualified to join by not meeting certain relatively set standards. The U.S. is just not welcome because it's extra regional or something like that. Is that a fair characterization or not?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're not welcome in that, just as the Hatoyama's East Asia community went over like a lead balloon in Washington when it was announced in 2009. Obviously, we may not want to go into RCEP. We may not even want to have anything to do with it, but we certainly don't want to be denied access to it. So it's probably a sub-theme that does exist. And of course, in that sense, there is a rivalry because we want to get TPP launched first so that China does not become the key leader, if you will, of a new regional architecture in Asia. And that's what I was trying to show in the slides, that if Japan is out, it joins RCEP. It becomes part of that other architecture. And it could indeed build, it may not have much of a reputation now, but it could build itself into something a lot more significant than seen now. So yeah, in that sense, the teeter-totter board that I put up there before does have a significance between the two. But certainly, remember, says TPP is not designed to contain or to isolate the China.
I want to add that the gains that the United States would have if it were to be able to join RCEP are fairly limited, given that RCEP is more about market access, whereas the real value in TPP is, it's getting late in the day, TPP is that it's called a model for the 21st century because of its rules-making framework rather than the tariff barriers that are coming down from it. So given those circumstances, the limit there, I don't think it's worth the United States actually trying to get a seat at the table.
And if I may even add to that, was mentioned in an earlier session that India is the sort of a stumbling block in the RCEP negotiations. Well, that's interesting because the others that are in those negotiations are already part of a intra-regional production network that includes not only Japan but many other countries, and also, oddly enough, includes ourselves. We're in the production network ourselves. I mean, what we produce in China is probably just the final stage of a product that was outsourced all over Asia. So indeed, we already are in a market-driven regional integration there. We wouldn't get anything out of it.
Okay, two last questions, one in the back and then a gentleman in the front.
AJ Sugarman, Carnegie Endowment. I was wondering if you could follow up just on that and discuss India's role in all of this a little bit more, and perhaps the implications for India if the TTP is implemented or the TPP is implemented before RCEP, and then how India has been delaying RCEP and what the prospects might be for that.
I'm not exactly sure of India's problems. Those comments that were made earlier, what indeed India is raising objections to, I don't know. But to me, it is the outsider, the outlier in that whole RCEP arrangement. So probably the issues are endemic to India's own economy. But certainly India is being wooed by many countries, including Japan and the United States. So it certainly doesn't need RCEP. It's got plenty of investment coming in. It's got plenty of interest from other countries. So it probably has a stake in RCEP, but and is being tough on it. But indeed, even if it's not a member of it, I think India stands pretty much on its own. Whether it will actually come into any other kind of mega system if RCEP fails, or if it suddenly bolts out of it, I don't know, because TPP at this point it doesn't extend that far. But at some point, we're reaching an Asia-Pacific FTA, and then eventually perhaps a revitalized WTO. Then eventually down the line, India falls into that category. So it's unclear.
Sorry, and I think it's also a reflection of India's non-alignment policy in the security front as well. But that said, Prime Minister Modi's first and foremost priority at the moment is economic security in India. And if joining RCEP does, the math adds up, I can't imagine that there would be any significant opposition to it.
Okay, the last question over here.
I'm Dave Rabinowitz. Speaking of outliers, there's one country with an Asian Pacific presence that hasn't been mentioned at all, and that's Russia. Does it show up anywhere in RCEP talks?
No.
Russia, Russia has its own deal. I mean, it's a gas station on the corner, and it sells a lot of gas in Asia. And I think it's pretty happy to to pick here and there. It deals with China when it wants to. It deals with Japan when it wants to. So it doesn't have to be part of anything. It is indeed the force in Asia that is making a lot of countries dependent on it and its prices. Japan, even though there are sanctions on Russia, still pursues its energy resource projects with Russia, and will continue to meet with Putin at the highest level.
All right, well, thank you very much for sticking with us till the end. And I guess this concludes the conference today.
A quick word in closing, which is once again to thank all of our panelists and our truly indefatigable audience for staying with us. I want to say one or two things in closing. First of all, thanks to Shihoko Goto and everyone at the Wilson Center for making this possible. It really has been one of the best experiences we've had doing FPRI conferences in Washington. I think arguably the best experience. We started this day talking about how we needed an economic foundation for the pivot or the rebalancing to be real, and that if we didn't, that whole security side of the equation would come unstuck. And then by the time we got to our economics panel, we were hearing about the domestic politics that might get in the way of building that economic foundation. So it's interesting to watch that feedback, and it did draw some of the connections that I had hoped would come out of this, and I think did very much today. On the other hand, there's another piece of this last panel that reminds me of our last conference on the great divergence between economics and politics, that as much of what we've heard on this panel is that the economics are going along actually not too badly. I mean, it may be the dismal science, but there is a sense that the forces of market integration have done a lot, and despite all the politics, we may even see the WTO be revived from its apparently post-Doha coma. And so compared to that relatively optimistic economic picture, politics, political science, I guess, is the even more dismal non-science that we heard about this morning, where there's still a great deal to worry about. Well, as today's discussion made amply clear, these issues are not going away soon. I'm sure we'll have occasion to revisit these in various other contexts, but once again, thank you all, and please join me in thanking the final panel and everyone from today's panels.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks. Very good to meet you.
Very nice to meet you.
I'll be in touch.
Yes.
I mean, I'm in town